Bé, gràcies per vindre, gràcies també a Acció Cultural per acollir l'acte i al Servei de Llengües de la Universitat, que l'ha patrocinat amablement. Conchúr Ó Giollagáin, ja sé que el nom és difícil, ell mateix diu que té un nom ofensiu per la dificultat de pronunciar-lo, és professor investigador a la Universitat de les Terres Altes i les Illes, de les Highlands and Islands, en Escòcia, al voltant d'Inverness, una universitat amb uns quants campus, un dels quals esteu veient en pantalla, que és el de la illa de Skye, que és un lloc que el dia que fa sol és fantàstic, i això passa una vegada cada pocs anys. Ell té una trajectòria curiosa perquè ell és irlandès de Dublín i comença el seu camí en l'activisme lingüístic amb el gaèlic irlandès, que és la llengua institucionalment i constitucionalment més protegida del món. O sigui, la llengua que té més reconeixement institucional i constitucional i, malgrat això, és una llengua en pràctica desaparició, que és una lliçó que potser ens interessa aprendre també. I, com he dit, treballa com a professor investigador en una universitat escocesa, tant parla gaèlic irlandès i parla gaèlic escocès, que no són el mateix idioma. Ara mateix n'hi ha grups gaèlics en la República d'Irlanda, en el nord d'Irlanda, sota sobirania del Regne Unit, i en Escòcia, i per tant ell té experiència amb els tres grups i una xarxa de col·laboradors importants. Recentment ha escrit un llibre sobre la temàtica que forma part del discurs, en fi, de les coses que ens dirà ara mateix. Ha estat unes quantes vegades ja a València i coneix el nostre cas. A mi m'ha paregut especialment interessant perquè ja sé que hi ha diferències importants entre la situació del gaèlic, tant l'irlandès com l'escocès, i la del valencià, però és bo recordar que ells també començaren sent una llengua de ple ús per a tot el món, en la societat on vivien, i ara mateix estan en percentatges realment baixos. De manera que simplement us deixo amb ell. Ell m'ha dit que si teniu preguntes sobre la marxa les feu, l'interrompeu i les feu, que ho preferís d'aquesta manera. De totes maneres, al final de la conferència tindrem un temps per al diàleg i podeu preguntar en anglès si voleu, o si voleu preguntar en valencià, doncs ja ho farem per d'acord? Moltes gràcies i bon dius.
Bon vespre, molt content d'estar ací amb tots vosaltres i agraït a Acció Cultural i a la Universitat per acollir. Thank you to everybody for coming along, and thank you to the University of Valencia and to the Acción for inviting me and organising this, and a special thanks for Ferran for helping a lot of preparation for this. I think I'll stand, but I've prepared a PowerPoint and it'll be easier if I present it from over here. Now, what I'm going to do, I prepared a lot. We don't have to go into much detail about everything, but I'll stop every now and then, and if people want to ask a question at a particular point, don't feel shy. I think Ferran made this point. So we'll break up the talk, and then if you want to ask a few questions, we'll answer them, and then we'll get back to the talk again. And I'll check in every now and then to see if it's getting too tiring or anything like that. There are parts of it we can go quickly through, and other parts we can go into a bit more detail. So I essentially want to talk about 3 points this evening. The main issue is the dynamics the societal dynamics of minority language groups when they live in competition with a majority group, which is the context for all minority languages. Then I want to look at the limitations of the language rights discourse. This basically is the underlying thinking of much of minority language planning in the global north or the liberal west. And then the final point, I want to look at the implications for the minorities for emphasizing this approach. You see the point I'm making here. This approach has caused the emergence of a social hierarchy and the ascendancy power. Ascendancy is the word those who rise to the top in society. The issue, of course, for us is how much in common does the ascendancy have with the normal speakers of the minority groups. We'll get into that in a bit more detail as we go on. Okay. Just to say also that there are data and insights behind what I'm going to talk about today. However, I'm not going to talk in detail about data simply because it's too tiring or tiresome, and I'll just give you in a very brief indication at the start what that data is indicating. I think it might be more interesting for people in other cultures to look at the way that the thinking has evolved because of the research process we've gone through. I've been involved in this type of research in Ireland, Scotland, for 25 years now, and I'm always amazed. All the effort, all the money, and all the institutional power we spend on this, and we're left with one simple question: why is it so ineffective? Or to put it very, very bluntly, why does minority language policy not work? And we're going to delve into today, now in this seminar, we're going to try if we can isolate some of the reasons. There's an element, you'll hear me talking about misdiagnosis. I use a medical metaphor. There's a misdiagnosis at the heart of what we're trying to do, and this is explaining to an extent why policy is so ineffective. Okay, you can see this is one of the books, the research process we went through by which we gained these insights, and the vernacular speaking group, the first language group speaking Scottish Gaelic, is down now to 11,000 people. And if we've gone through a similar type of research process in Ireland, the comprehensive linguistic study of the Gaeltacht, that's the Irish speaking districts in the west basically, and that was 2007. That was updated in 2015. The speaker group, despite all the policy, and you made this point in your introduction, all the constitutional backing and all the institutional backing, the speaker group, this is after 4 generations of language policy and language planning. After 4 generations of this, the group has declined to 20,000 people, and that doesn't mean all those speakers are good speakers, they just pertain to the social geography of the native speaking group. So this is the point we're making. If we put so much effort into it, what return have we got in society? And I think you made this point, Ferran, also, the big difference between the institutional engagement with the issue and then the way the issue has been taken up in society. This is another piece of research we've done. I'm just trying to give a broad indication of the amount of work we've done I'm trying to show from where all this analysis has come. This was the analysis of bilingual competence. Young native speakers of Irish in the most densely Irish-speaking area in the west of Ireland. And I would ask the question, why is the level of Irish language acquisition, these were the native speakers of course, but it's even more challenging for the learners. Why is the level of acquisition non-optimal? That's despite 4 generations of language policy and planning. Non-optimal, what we mean by that is that they don't speak it to the level you would expect from native speaking competence. Okay? And I believe to an extent where this is a universal theme, where you have a minoritized group in competition with the majority group, generally the young speakers will not speak the minority language, even if they're native speakers, as well as they speak the majority language. You can go into, that's written, there's a bilingual publication if you want to look that up. It's basically linguistic data. The other studies are We've published other books also. There's a team involved in this, and I would ask the question here. These two books have looked at the problem of decontextualization. What I mean by that is you take the cultural problem out of its context, out of its social geography, and the de-societalization. There is no emphasis on social process. This explains to an extent why the institutions put so much emphasis on the official policy rather than on social policy. And I would ask the question, why has formal minority language policy and planning flourished institutionally in Ireland? In other words, the institutions have flourished, but the society has not. Okay, right. That's just the research background. I said I wasn't going to go into detail in that, we can all look these up in our own time. Also, I'd like you to remember 6 what I think are common features of minority languages, where they're highly minoritized and in too much competition with the majority. There are institutional features as well, but we'll look at the societal ones first. Generally, when there's strong competition, the minority group is losing its number of speakers, and more importantly, it's losing the social density. In other words, it can't keep a dense population of native speakers in all generations. The second point, well, if you lose your density, well, then you start losing your geography. They don't have dense enough populations in a wide geographic area. They're losing that density. Then this is the issue of non-optimal acquisition. There, even where we have minority speakers, there is a social preference for the use of the majority language rather than the minority language, even if they've been raised in that language. And with minority language, with hundreds of thousands, in some cases a million speakers, they can go through this process as well. It's the process of minoritization, independent of the actual numbers of the speakers. The fourth point is, this is, as we've seen also in the analysis of bilingual competence, that we have higher linguistic attainment in the majority language rather than in the minority language. This is because of the non-optimal acquisition. And then the fifth point, there is a reduction in the social esteem, the respect that the culture is held, even in the minority group, for the esteem that is held for their cultural capital, to use the phrase that Pierre has. So this is the competitive dynamic. And then generally, when the community becomes over-minoritized, the obvious trajectory or trend is towards monolingualization, despite what they assert in policy. Okay, I'm just going to stop there for a second now. Have you got used to my accent? Am I speaking too fast, or is it clear enough? Is it? Yes?
The accent is perfect, thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you to precise, because you're speaking of active speakers,
Yes.
but here in Valencia normally we speak not only of active speakers, but also of the passive ability to understand the language. For us it's important.
Yes.
And when you're speaking about social densities, does that affect the ability of someone to live a normal life in Gaelic? I mean, they can go shopping in Gaelic or go to the town council and make things in the paperwork work in Gaelic?
That depends on the social density. What are the proportions? Are there high percentages in a given area? But I would say in most areas, no. That you go into shops, businesses, official bodies, generally you would have to defer to the majority language, both in Ireland and in
They
Scotland.
can't understand Gaelic?
Oh, they could. Yes, I take your point about passive. For example, there are many more people in Ireland that report an understanding of Irish, but the emphasis I have here is on the actual societal use. So, for example, if you look at our census, it's 40% of the population say that they can understand Irish. There is no way, from a sociolinguistic or a sociological point of view, that is true. If 40% of the national population understood a language, you would hear it all around you. We don't. even in the native speaking areas, you have to go and look for it if you want. So there's, for example, how do we get from 1.7 million speakers, or people who understand it, your passive speakers, how do we get from 1.7 million down to 20,000 vernacular speakers? What is in the policy that creates that massive gap between, I think what they're doing in the census is they're voting, it's aspiration, it's what they want to see, but they don't realise what's involved in going through the social process to help these people be active speakers. Yes?
Sorry, the 1.7 million would refer to native Irish speakers way back in the 20s, maybe?
No, that's today. That's today. These would be the national population. 40% of the national population.
Sorry, you're referring to people who claim to understand. Right.
Right. Will we go on then? Okay. Right. Thanks a million. Anytime I have a question, interrupt me. That's what I was saying at the start. Now, if we look at the common institutional features, yes. Okay.
I just wanted to emphasize the importance of the last point in the previous slide.
Yeah.
I think here in Spain, our experience is that for many years, like the institutions, the central government, were trying to sell that the bilingual ideology. Like all the Valencian-speaking people or Catalan-speaking people should become bilingual for their good, for their own good, you know.
Yes.
And once we are all bilingual, now they say, why do you need this minority language for if you're all Spanish speakers?
Yes.
Okay, so it's clear the trick that the dominant language is playing through this bilingual ideology, right? It's like 2 steps extermination, right? You all become bilingual first, and second, we will ask you the big question: what do you need your minority language for? So
well,
that's
a very good question, and we all need to ask this question of all those who are involved in language policy. If the language policy is so successful as the organisers of these different initiatives or managers of these different bodies, why are the actual communities becoming less bilingual? The trend undoubtedly is towards monolingualization, and we do not honestly deal with that or accept that in these language bodies. This is part of the misdiagnosis that I made. We'll get to this eventually. Okay. If we move on to the institutional features then, just keeping in mind the 6 societal features that we mentioned initially, well then we can see that official minority language planning and policy, it seems to be in a contradictory relationship, or it actually ignores the societal reality of the speakers, of the minority language speakers. It's ignoring the issue of threat and endangerment. The second point is the weak social traction of bureaucratic bodies. They gain traction politically and institutionally, but they have very little traction in the actual community of speakers. The third point is because the sociology of the approach is so weak, therefore they have to emphasize the symbolic aspect of the civic engagement, and this generally tends to be at the expense of forming credible policies, credible social policy. And this leads to this issue earlier, a more very kind question there, this gap between the aspiration, what we think we're achieving, or what the institutions are asserting they're achieving, and what the actual outcomes in the community turn out to be. So this basically, to put it in a nutshell, this is the conflict between a language in institutions approach rather than a language in society approach, to use that Fishmanian argument. We have generally, because of the dominant discourse now in language policy in the global north, what we now have is a disregard of language in society for a preference for language in institutions, which isn't working, basically, to put bluntly. Okay, right. Putting those two sets of features, the institutional features with the societal features, and we try to look at the outcome. This is what is leading to what I call a confused analysis of the problem. The contradictory outcome of language, minority language bodies supporting or promoting a misdiagnosis. It generally tends to favour an individualistic approach, so in other words, if individuals want to take an interest, they support that, but they will not engage in a collective approach to these issues. We all see what the difficulty there is. You cannot have a minority language unless you have a collective engagement with the issue. And because of this, the lack of emphasis on the collective, there seems to be now a naive prioritisation of resource and funding. We generally emphasise this expenditure on schools rather than putting the emphasis where we need it. Schools are important, of course, but an emphasis on schools without an emphasis on community and society, in other words, the collective, I think, is a misdiagnosis, a misreading of the problem. But probably more serious than all this is, because of the current provision in the language rights discourse, we have set up what I refer to here. We are promoting a sectoralist approach towards minority language. A sectoralist approach means promoting a language in chosen sectors. So, for example, schooling, the media, the arts, the symbolic use in public administration. We'll go into this in a bit more detail further down, but I think this has led to a situation, it's not the only cause of it, of course, but this has led to a situation by what I refer to there as a disadvantageous social ranking system. It has also led to a clientelist hierarchy. So clients of the official bodies, they rise to the top of a hierarchy and they dominate the resources and attention. And because of the ranking system and the hierarchy, which is not addressing communal needs, the disregard of the collective, what this is leading to now is it's alienating the average speaker from the official provision for the minority. The average speaker feels that the bodies are not taking on their concerns in what they're promoting in the different sectors. We can come back to this later in the questions. However, this is the main issue I want to talk about today. It's this issue of dynamics, and these insights have come from years and years of research on these issues, mainly in Ireland, but also in Scotland. And I think they are pertinent to all minority groups that feel this overbearing sense of minoritisation. In other words, that the majority has full social agency in many social and institutional contexts where you think that the minority would have some support. Right, so I'll talk first. There's a few bits of terminology and key concepts. If we grasp them together, it's easier to go through the process there. In a dynamic, there is direction, because we have a vertical axis and then we have a horizontal axis. We'll get into them in a second. There's also process, that you move from one stage in a social process to the next stage, and you can't progress to the second stage unless you go through the first stage. We do not put enough emphasis on the issue of process. Then there's the third point, yes, here, there are participants. And then the fourth point, that there is competition between those participants. Some participants are more equal than others, therefore they get the attention and the resource. So in other words, it's a competitive dynamic. And again, we're back to this word, naivety, because we don't recognize the level of the competitive nature of the dynamic, we don't realize the actual struggles that, again, go back to this phrase, the struggles that the average speaker of the minority language has. Right, if I could just break this down, we'll go slowly through this, it's a bit complicated. If we look at the issue, this is direction. There are 2 points here that are salient, and we're aware of this already. The issue of transfer, the skills of the language and the associated culture of the language. And so that's the vertical axis, isn't it? So the language and the skills and the cultural knowledge, that is transferred down through the generations. That works downwards, basically. So that's vertical. Then we have the horizontal axis, which goes across society, and that refers to practice. And it's not just practice in institutions, as I've been saying earlier. The important point is it's an array of social areas. So community, schools, institutions, promotional bodies, other cultural activities. So that's our horizontal axis. And you can see it there. You're going to see this chart now in a second. This is the vertical transfer, and this is the horizontal axis. I'll explain all these quadrants in a second. Okay? Right. The other key component of this is process. And this is the point I was making earlier, that there's progression from one stage to the next. The first process is the acquisition in transmission. We can refer to that as the primary socialization of the minority language in a familial situation. So a family unit, for instance, are from one generation to the next. The second process, this is why we have this non-optimal acquisition, because there's not enough of this, the social reinforcement of the minority language in the peer group. That's in other words, the young in their own age group, their own peer cohort, practicing the minority language and reinforcing its cultures. That's why I refer to this issue of social reinforcement. The third process then is civic reinforcement. That's its use in the institutions that support the minority culture. Schools, language bodies, public institutions, public bodies, promotion bodies, cultural activities, so on and so forth. And the fourth point then is this, when we arrive into the fourth point, after going through, what's the word, process, after going through the different stages, we arrive at what I'm referring to here as a coherent collective identity. In other words, people feel, after going through all these social and societal processes, they feel they are members of a meaningful language culture. Okay. And so here we are. I'm referring to them here as quadrants. Quadrant 1, this is the acquisition in transmission. Quadrant 2, this is practice among the peer group. Okay. Quadrant 4, participation in schooling or institutions, and quadrant 3, participation in schooling and institutions. And quadrant 4, that's where you begin to feel I am part of an identifiable, coherent culture that has many members. Okay.
I always find that lacks a previous part of the process, always in every minority language, is that we need a debate in the society, because if you have a minority language, you have to spend a lot of energy, resources,
Yes.
in order to keep it. So don't you think you need another step previous to this, so the society can decide it's my minority language important to me, and we will do the sacrifices in order to keep it?
Yes, that's a very good point. We'll come to that in a second. We'll start to talk about the participants, and I think that's where your question then comes. So can we come back to that when we get later on?
Is it maybe, sorry, just really shortly, is it maybe that this diagram applies more to the situation when there's still some amount of speakers, and then when you really minorize the language, then you go maybe to this next situation?
Yes.
So it's two different phases.
Yes. For example, if we take, I was going to come to it, but I might as well deal with it now. You see the completed circle here. So that's the idealized dynamic, that it goes around all the quadrants, that the participants are gaining from the collective reinforcement and the resources and the cultural capital. But I was going to explain this in a second, and this is your point, Johan. What we have here, because the minority group loses speakers from generation to generation, and subsequent generations don't have the same type of acquisition. Therefore, this is the basic difficulty of language aid. It's not completing the circuit. And every time it doesn't complete the circuit, in a given social geography, it loses more speakers. So I think, yeah, so then we come to your question. So if, when I present a few more slides, if it's not answered, come back to me and we'll get into it in more detail. Is that okay so far? Am I going slowly enough, fast enough, or that's okay, is it? Yes, okay.
Yes, I suppose that you will speak about that further in the speech. I think that technologies now play an important role in this kind of socialization. I mean,
Yes.
And there are things that are out of the reach of the same society.
Yes.
Because, for instance, the ability to speak with Alexa in Irish,
Yes.
in Gaelic,
Yes.
it does not depend of the Irish government or the Irish society. It depends of a company that is in another country and decides if
Yes. There is.
want or not to offer that possibility. And that reflects on the, I mean, if you are with another friend at school and he is able to speak in his language with Alexa, but you are not able to speak with Alexa in your language, then objectively you are in disadvantage on the relationship
Yes.
with your friend.
Undeniably, there is a technological element to this, but primarily it's societal. Second order problem we're going to have. When computerization becomes responsive to oral prompts, then the minority, you can see what's going to happen there for the minorities. There's going to be, what do they call it, digital deserts, basically. It's a big problem. But I'm talking at a more fundamental level of society. And again, we cannot be raised by a computer. We need to be raised in a collective of speakers still. And computers aren't going to change that.
So far.
So, well, from what we know of them so far.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Sorry, forgive me, we're only at the introductory phase of this. So we move on then. The fourth component, this issue of participants. Participants are basically social players in a culture, and what we have there are the first language speakers, the second language speakers, and some, because of migrations now, we have third and fourth language speakers of minority languages, of course, and therefore you're going to see these different groups. I'm going to portray them in quadrants as we go along in a while. So we have the participants of the first language minority culture, what we traditionally, it's old-fashioned now, I can accept that, what we traditionally refer to as the native speakers of the minority culture. Then we have the participants of the majority culture, often in the same milieu of the social geography of the minority group. Then we have what I refer to, these are new phrases now I'm coming up with, the participants in a minority tangential culture. So it's a tangent, it's not the primary culture, but it's important. And then there's another element, especially in the Irish situation where there are so many learners in comparison to native speakers, this issue of the 40% of the population claiming some ability to language. I refer to them as the participants in the neo-culture. I refer to it as it's not the most delicate phrase, but because it's so distant from the vernacular culture, I think it's fair enough to refer to it as a neo-culture. And then, of course, we have getting into power dynamics. You have to look at community leaders and sectoral leaders as well.
And what would an example of the tangential?
I'll explain. We're coming to it, but it's all explained. So we need the diagrams. Okay. And then this issue of everybody is not equal. Despite some of the naive assertions of minority language social policy, there is social competition, and the competition creates a dynamic. There's a dynamic that's working in the trajectory that builds minority confidence and capacity. That comes from the positive distribution of power on behalf of the minority. And then there's what I refer to as an anti-dynamic. Those that work against a positive dynamic. And that can be internal and external. So in other words, some of the difficulty is within the minority group itself, not to allow ourselves to be naive about these social issues. Okay, right. So basically, the concepts and the terminology that we're going to use now to explain this and we're going to go, this is only the initial phase of it, we're going to build it up, and it's going to show the complexity and the competition between the different layers. Okay. And what we're starting with here, so if you remember, so axis, the vertical axis, the horizontal axis, so it's working like a cross, and then there's a flow, a dynamic going around it. The flow can be positive or the flow can be negative. So that's your dynamic trajectory and your anti-dynamic trajectory going at the same time. And your point there, this is the ideal, what I call this here, this is the general societal process of a functional culture. So in other words, majority cultures, where they go through this process, they probably are unaware that they're going through it, but this is how their societies become so successful. And I have the minority culture here because there are less and less, in comparison to previous generations, that have experience of the primary socialization of the language in a familial communal unit. So less experience of socialization. One. Then there's, if the numbers are contracting, there are fewer young people to go through the secondary socialization, the peer group socialization. Therefore, that becomes, they have less experience of the social use of the minority language in their own use cohort in society. So therefore, we have a challenge in quadrant 1, and we have a challenge in quadrant 2. And then we move into the social reinforcement in schools, cultural bodies, media, promotion bodies, so on and so forth, civic administration, and if the through flow of people is becoming less and less in the primary quadrants, but then we have less here to participate in building up the cultural, the institutional culture that feeds back into the group, and therefore, and we come to the final quadrant here, so as less people become involved in the first 3 quadrants, well then we have these issues starting up. What is the level of coherence? So coherence, in other words, you feel that the society you're participating in is whole and the different participants in it are helping each other. In other words, it's creating this collective dynamic, what am I using? The dynamic trajectory. Okay. But because this is becoming more and more difficult now in the context of the minoritized speaker groups, the cycle, the trajectory is completed. And basically, that's the sociological explanation, I think, of language shift. Okay, right. So we'll add in the different groups now, okay? And you see here, it's a completed circle. This is I refer to it as majoritarian. So this is the majority group with majoritarian thinking. In other words, they don't care about the minority. And this works both ways. You see it has you have to look at all these circles. They have arrows on them. So it's indicating the way it's going, or it should be going at least. And the majoritarian culture has a very big arrow, because obviously it works for itself. But then it has a smaller arrow because it works also, when it's majoritarian, it works against the minority. So in other words, it's breaking down the minority in the different quadrants that would be dynamic for the minority. Okay. Right. So the third group then, this is what I refer to here as the tangential culture, and this is your very kind question there, what this refers to. These are, I'm going to tell you this about myself in a second, but the members of the tangential majority, you know in mathematics that you have a tangent, it's an angle that comes in, so it didn't have the previous trajectory, but now it reflects or it intersects with it. And the reason I have it here, it's not these are people that haven't experienced the primary socialization in the minority culture, but they've learnt it both from, this is why it intersects quadrant 3 and 4, they've learnt the language from seeing it operating in some type of peer group socialization. So in other words, that they've seen the language, the language in real life culture. So especially if teenagers from the majority culture are friends in the minority culture and they learn it in a natural setting, they don't rely only on schooling. But some of them have the influence of the schooling is important. So and I have look at the arrow again. These people tend to be supportive because they have some experience of the societal culture. They tend to work with the dynamic flow and support of the minority. Okay. However, we add in now the fourth group, and these are the participants in the what I'm referring to here as the neoculture, because the minority language identity is important to them, and this is why I have it here. It's up at this level here, but it's come out of this discourse about minority identity, minority competition with the majority, the role of the minority culture in a state or in a given polity. However, you can see some of these participants in the neoculture, the neo-identity, they can switch over to the tangential culture as they become more fluent. They want to participate in the social setting of the language. Therefore, it can work in a positive dynamic, but also some of the tangential culture, they can lose contact with the original socialization they had and then they start acting like learners. So in other words, tangential, these are active users, speakers of the language. The neo-identity are more passive. I think that was your question.
Why the identity arrows go against?
Because when the neo-identity of the minority culture is promoted, they do it independently of the actual social problems of the minority. So in other words, we're back to this issue of decontextualization and desocialization. In other words, they want an interest in the culture, but they have no interest whatsoever in the societal reality of it. That if they get attention and resource, they can become very destructive in the dynamic. But I'm taking it here as a positive, and you see the arrows. It can help in one way and take away on another. However, we have to look at this issue of assimilation. So assimilation means the drag of one culture into the sphere of another culture. Okay? And you can see the arrows in different ways. So there's a general loss from a minority culture to majority group. That's how language shift occurs. The members of the neo-culture, they basically come from the majority, so that's why the arrow comes this way. They can lose interest in the minority culture, so it goes back again. The tangential group, they come from the minority group, but they can give help to the minority, so that's why the arrow goes both ways for them. However, when I'm referring to the neo-identity, where it's based only on an interest in learning the language, it's not interested in the cultural capital of the minority or in the social processes that the normal speakers live with. And I'm referring to that therefore as a counter dynamic, and that's why the other arrows are supportive of the minority culture. I think when that ideology is promoted independent of the social reality of the speakers, that becomes anti-dynamic. In other words, it has more in common with the majority culture than it has with the minority.
This would be the failure of the investment.
Yes, yes. In other words, what they do, as we know, politicians and leaders of institutional bodies, they like expediency. So expediency is what's easy. So it's much easier to deal with the neo-identity because it's children in classrooms. It is much more difficult to devise social policy that deals with a collective problem. Now we're into neoliberalism and post-modernity. It's very, very difficult now for states, especially if they're expedient or lazy, to develop social policy that is relevant to a minority. Okay. Right, so this, we put it all together and we put our different groups together, our minority culture that finds it difficult to complete the circle, In competition, this is the competition between participants with a functional majoritarian culture. Then we have our tangential, this is the supportive learners who have some experience of the social group. Then we have the anti-dynamic of the neo-identity, those who are concerned about the erosion or the engagement. Okay, right. I think we're moving into another section, so I'm just going to stop and ask, how are we all doing? We're okay? Yeah? Does anybody else want to ask a question? Can I ask, was that okay to follow? It made sense. Okay, right. Right, we need to ask the next set of questions. Well, if this is the reality, now this is new theory, so obviously it's not there in the literature and it's not there in the public bodies, so we haven't got to this level yet. But we need to ask now, the thinking we are all embedded in to an extent, even if we don't like it, because this is the dominant thinking that is used by states that have a supportive. It's the language rights discourse, basically. And I think we have a basic difficulty here now, where we have a liberal state trying to support minority language diversity, but basically I've characterized, if this is what we talked about previously, that's the societal dynamic. The policy isn't engaging or intersecting properly with the social reality of the speakers. For what we have there is language promotion without language protection. In other words, we're promoting a language and not protecting the existing speakers. The existing speakers are losing their societal position, and then in a contradictory way, we're supporting minority language promotion. It doesn't make any sense. In other words, it's promotion in language. I'll go very quickly through this. There are 4 interrelated difficulties coming from this. One is what I've just mentioned, language promotion without language protection. I've already mentioned diagnostics.
What is missing? What is missing in the promotion?
They're not looking at this, they're not protecting the existing group of speakers.
I understand that promotion means to have, let's say, some investment.
Yes.
Yeah. But what about protection? I mean,
But
what is missing
it's
to protect
it's
to
not
make it properly?
We'll get to that in a second. The issue is not addressed, basically. There's a naive thinking in it that if we promote it for everybody, that automatically protects the existing body. It's not. Promotion serves the needs of the learners, the second language speakers. Promotion in itself isn't sufficient for the existing first language speakers, because what you need there is social policy. You don't need language policy. So what we have, ironically, is we have language policy with weak social policy. So in other words, it's the mix between promoting a culture where you're not engaging in enough community development for the minority first language group. But I'm going to say more about that. Thank you for the question. I'm going to say more about that. It relates to the second question as well. In other words, we're not diagnosing the problem properly. We're coming up with a partial diagnosis, and then we're asking the question, why doesn't it work? Well, we should engage in a full diagnosis first before we start prescribing. It's a bit like you go to the doctor, you say to the doctor, what's wrong with you? You'll ask him, can you diagnose? What is it? What is the name for it? What do you do about it? We're not even at that level yet in our language cultures, I feel. Then I've mentioned this earlier. The third point is this sense that minority language policy is promoting individualism and sectoralism. This is promotion, you see. Go back to your question, where is the protection? And then the fourth point is, what's happened is, because of the disregard of social reality, in other words, language shift or decline of the existing speaker group, what we have in the disregard of that social fact, what we have is emphasis on ascendancy thinking. Ascendancy, those in society who rise to the top. They get their needs met. The average member of society is not addressed by the emphasis that they put on their institution. So in a way, what I'm saying there is basically that often minority language bodies are implicated in the demise of the speaker group themselves because they are not addressing the problem issue from an accurate diagnosis. Okay. Right, so we go through these very quickly, and hopefully this will answer the question you had there earlier. What I mean by language promotion without language protection, that's where we have an officially sponsored process of language revitalization. We think we're revitalizing the language. However, the projects that emerge from the promotion, they occur in the context of speaker group decline. Actual members of the fully competent members of that speaker group are reducing in number. So that, therefore, we have the irony of language promotion with ongoing language shift. So we're promoting something that is in decline, basically, and then we have a language policy agenda which does not address the socio-political issue of disempowerment. And I think this refers to your question here. We allow the ongoing disempowerment of the minority group, and then, to an extent, we tolerate naive language promotion initiatives, which are basically projects rather than a coherent set of strategies. So, continuing with this dynamic, especially if you are associated with a small minority language group, the Gaelic group of Ireland and Scotland are not far away from this. What we are going to have now is a language policy but no language group. I published last year, I think it was, I published an article on the issue that the language bodies, the promotional bodies, will probably outlast the speaker group. And nobody asked the question, but why do we have these bodies if they're not there to protect or to empower this issue? Protection means empowering the group that exists. They're not doing it. The second point then, the problem in minority language social dynamics, that we have, and I've made this point already, I'll make it again, it was important, that we have prescriptions, to use a medical term, we have prescriptions for the minority language culture that are not rooted in a diagnosis of the societal challenge, again, that the average speaker lives with. That policy, as currently formed under the language rights discourse, is not enhancing the capacity of the speaker group to address their own problems in the given social geography of the speaker group. And then, because there's an avoidance of an accurate diagnostic of the issue, there tends to be this issue of the managers or the senior personnel in these language bodies defending their own position rather than trying to address the issue that is out there in society. And this is why we get this phrase of a tendency to gatekeeping. The people who are in charge stand at the gate and they will let. This is why we can't have a diagnosis. It's not a democratic dialogue about a societal issue. It's a controlled dialogue. So it's a bit like the thinking that the Stasi had in Eastern Germany. If you want a democratic solution, you have to open up the flows of data, thinking, insights, and so on and so forth. In other words, you allow people to participate in elaborating communities. And that's put all these issues together. What this is going to give us is we're going to have, I've used this word before, we're going to have an emphasis on what is expedient, in other words, what is easy, rather than what is required. So that means we have our gatekeepers, and they're in charge of managing the decline so it doesn't look bad for the state that is purported to have a minority language culture. Okay. Now, very quickly, we'll go on to this, the third aspect of this, which is this problem of individualism and sectoralism. So we understand what individualism is. So the policy is great if an individual wants to learn it in school and it enhances them personally or professionally. So generally, the existing policy works for that. It also works for the sectoralists. So if you have a position of power in a key sector for language promotion, which generally tends to be again, where we have the language rights discourse, it generally tends to be schooling, the media, the arts, academia, and symbolic use in public administration. If you have a position of power or influence in that sector, you are very, very powerful there over these are the people generally that form the gate. And this is putting them all together. What we have therefore is we can have on one level, because we're spending money, public money, we can have sectoral progress, but the sectoral progress that doesn't address the concerns of the speakers. In other words, the people that are not directly involved in management of these sectors. Okay. And
Sorry.
yes?
I think we always have a problem is that if you earn your money or your share in state administration
Yes.
by living within a problem,
Yes.
you don't want to solve it because you stop winning that money. And that also happens with a lot of NGO because most of the people that work on this NGO, they can believe in language. And if they solve the problem, they will want to earn more money.
Yes, I can see how you're thinking like that. It's systems that work for a small cohort. They're very anti-democratic. So, what I'm calling for here is cultural change. That we need a democracy has to be seen in the way you conduct the public debate. The debate here about the minority cultures, it's far too controlled. There's a controlling aspect. This is why I use this. It's a bit like the former Soviet bloc. Certain key individuals determine all thinking and all priorities. It's very, very destructive towards minority culture. We should come back to that issue in the questions and answers. Right. I'm going to whiz through just very quickly. I'm coming towards the end now. I'm probably going to have to set aside some of the explanations of taking a bit longer than I was planning. So, ascendancy thinking, the people who rise to the top are in control, and so this is coming about essentially because of the emphasis we put on status planning. And I think you referred to this. So, of all the minority languages in the world, Irish has probably the most provision. So it's constitutionally recognised. We have dozens of centrally funded national bodies promoting Irish language in sectors again. Why doesn't it work to a better degree? It's essentially because those in control of the sectors are neglecting the societal process, this disregard of social reality, and they prefer to, this is your point, they prefer to protect their existing advantage in the policy apparatus rather than dealing with the consequences of disregard of the existing sectors, how existing sectors disregard. So, and so in other words, that's the issue of the ascendancy, protecting themselves rather than protecting the group. In the disregard, that was your kind of question, if we disregard the disempowerment of the speaker group, well, all they have left then is to protect their advantage in the sectors. And putting this all together, what we have now is power brokers that have risen to institutional ascendancy. They are monopolizing attention. You get attention off the state, therefore also you get users. Okay. Right. I'm not going to go into this detail. This will take a bit of a while. I think I'll just skip through this. What I'm trying to emphasize here, these are three different polities, I suppose. And they all have a fairly similar policy setup. And you can see the words promotion, sectoralism, there's type of postmodern revivalism as well. A lot of it is in Ireland now, it's because the emphasis is on the learner, so it's you consume the culture. So it's occasional, you don't live it. Just very quickly, the thinking behind this I refer to, I'll come just to the question in a second. The thinking behind this is the word, it's derivative. It is derived from somewhere else. It lacks originality. You haven't done your original analysis of the situation you live in. Therefore, this is where we get back to the issue of misdiagnosis. It's like you subcontract out your thinking, and then you try to localize it without going through the intellectual process of trying to examine it yourself. So we don't need to go into it too deep. Basically, what we did, we asked the French Canadians to do our homework, and when the homework didn't work out right, we blamed the minority for not adapting to this marvelous thinking we've imported from somewhere else. You do your own thinking. You can learn from other circumstances, but you always need to do your own thing. Okay? And again, I'm not going to go through this in detail. The constraints from the derivative thinking that shows up in the community, in the power institutions, and in the intellectual leadership. So again, I don't have enough time to explain it in detail, but in the community, because of the sectoral approach, they feel contained and disempowered. Then the power institutions, there's a derivative aspect of an inherited legacy, that they're operating, someone else did the thinking, they institutionalize it, and then they're operating it, and not asking the question, why is it working, why is it not working? And then the intellectual leadership, this is both in academia and in public discourses. I think a lot of that thinking is what I refer to there as asocial and dissociated. It's not associated with the actual reality of speakers. Right, sorry, I've gone very quickly there. I want to get to, there's one other important issue and then we can leave it there. I mentioned this point of a social hierarchy or a social ranking system that comes out of this sectoral approach to minority language promotion. Again, it's your kind of question. The difference between promotion and protection. Not enough emphasis on promotion, not enough emphasis on protection. Therefore, the promotion is creating this hierarchy. Now, do we have energy? Will I spend 2 or 3 minutes on this? I think it's important. This approach to minority language policy and planning, these are just to give examples of the participants. The important point are the categories, are the social groups that emerge. We have 3 basic groups. What I refer to as the referent class, a professional category, and a social group. Okay? And very quickly, I'm explaining a referent class here. These are in other words, the people to whom the people who are referred to, basically. So in other words, the people to whom deference is shown. These are the people who frame the public perception of an issue. They decide on priority. They devise policy. They create the context for the distribution of resource, spending money basically, and then they manage the expectation among the people. In other words, those who don't have power within the sector groups. And then because of minority language policy, in the referring class, basically we have, this is from my perception of the Gaelic world, at the top we have the cultural and philological scholars, we have the cultural practitioners, then senior media professionals, then the language policy professionals, and language policy academics. So you can see there in the referring class, if you're very senior in the sectors, you will be referred to when money is being allocated. You will have a lot of control. Now, then below that, the professional category, these are basically the people who put the policy into operation. These are your professionals. In other words, it's like the civil servants of the minority culture, and they tend to be the junior or middle rank media professionals, your policy professionals, your language science specialists, so corpus planners, dictionary workers, writers, broadcasters, so on and so forth, and then your local language officials. At the end then, we have the social group. You can see how far we've gone down the hierarchy. We have the native speaking middle class, the autochthonous middle class as I'm referring to there, the middle class of L2 acquirers, Then we have the non-professional L2 acquirers and the non-professional autochtons, non-professional native speakers. So, again, I'm only hypothesizing here. We can prove this by showing the money involved in the different sectors, but you can see the obvious difficulty here. The actual speaker group is too far away from the top of the ranking system. It's a bit like pre-modern feudal society, that you have a tiny cohort of people in charge of fairly elaborate social policy and budgets. Right, I'll just skip through this one and we'll jump through the who are the winners and losers. Okay, and again I'm hypothesizing, and it'll be interesting to see if this resonates with the Valencian situation. So we're back to the question of, we're going to have language promotion but no language protection. With no language protection, there's going to be no social group left. We just have either learners or participants in the culture in the school system, basically, or cultural practitioners. Okay? So, and I'm calling this those who accept the current situation of promotion without protection. I'm calling they're in neoliberal, they're in neoliberal acquiescence with the existing trend towards the erosion or the erasure of the remaining American. Who will the winners be there? Obviously, the majority speakers are the winners, because they have no competition anymore. Okay? Then there's complacent politicians, politicians who don't care about the issue. Then there's the complacent sectoral leaders in the minority culture, the sectoral leaders that do not have enough energy or curiosity to develop an accurate diagnosis of the problem. Then we have the elite class and language planning bodies, so the language promotion bodies, they're elite. Then what I refer to as this is particularly true of the Irish and Scottish context, I refer to them as the asocietal philologists and minority language cultures. In other words, they persist and they flourish in their academic context simply because they dissociate themselves from the social reality of speaking. And also, again, you saw this, the neo-identity in the circular dynamic. This is the anti-dynamic involved in the learners. Well, those involved in the new speakerist ideology, those promoting an ideology for a minority culture that is completely divorced from the process towards language shift that is happening in the minority. And then also, I refer also those who are interested in the culture of minority group. I call them the minority language leisure class. So it's an issue of leisure. It's nothing, again, nothing to do with social or political reality. And then we have the learners, the L2 learners, the second language learners, and users and consumers. They consume it when they're involved with a school or a language promotion body. Beyond that, there's no relevance to it. However, so to an extent, if we continue with what we're doing, these people will have their needs met. However, we have to look, well, who will because the trajectory is generally towards the disappearance or the erasure group, these are going to be the losers. And again, I think some of these are jump out, they're quite obvious. Obviously, the minority language, first language speaker. Why? Because there's so few speakers to engage in communal activity with. Where are you going to get your friends, your peer group, your schoolmates, so on and so forth. Then we have the L2 speakers, and I have to put my cards on the table here. I'm not a native speaker of Irish, I learned it. I would be, in my analysis, I would be a tangential speaker. That I learned it off a social peer group when I was a teenager. So I've seen the culture in action, and I've lived in these areas for a while. So in other words, I participated. Then the minority language learners with an interest in the collective culture. So if you're interested in the culture more so than just the school subject, this is going to be an awful loss to you as well. And then the aesthetic practitioners, so those involved in cultural activity who rely on the collective, they are going to lose out because the inspiration for what they do in art, and aesthetic production is going to be limited. And of course, the learners down the road in future generations, what's going to happen to them? There will be no cohort of native speakers from which they can learn in a social union. They will be after the minority language speakers, they will be the big learners. This is the irony that the current new speakers ideologues cannot answer. What are the new speakers going to do when there's no native speaking community? Okay, right. I'll finish with this one. You've been very patient. It's been a long session. Yeah, actually, the questions helped break it up a little, so I think it made it a bit easier for me. I hope it was easy for you guys as well. However, right, the legacy of current thinking. Basically, language policy has become disembedded from the social context. And if we continue with this trajectory, all we're going to have left is basically a heritage model. So it's, you don't live it, you participate in a heritage. That is a heritage experience that schooling or promotion bodies provide. So therefore, the challenge therefore is, what can we do now to introduce a societal perspective in minority language policy that goes way beyond the limitations of promotion and to do that, I think we need four things. These would be optimal, and they would change the debate. The first is, we need to put emphasis on the politics of empowerment of highly threatened groups. In other words, those in charge of policy do not continue with this happy, clappy approach that everything is marvelous. Admit reality, that we are dealing with something very difficult, and we need to start talking about social reality. The second point is, there is no point and I think this is your question there is no point in engaging in language promotion unless we're going to start getting involved in the socioeconomic issues and the community development issues. In other words, the practicalities that help a minority to persist. The third point is, we need to start looking at complementarity. To get away from this thinking, oh, I get support from a certain sector, therefore I don't need to be concerned about the broader social context. We need to look at issues of complementarity, that progress in one sector helps progress in another sector, and progress in the sectors helps the first language speaker group and the learners. What's left out at the minute is the empowerment issues of the first language speaker group. And the fourth point then is, because to give language promotion, even though I think it's incredibly naive, to give language promotion its due, to recognise what it's achieved, it has opened up an academic and an aesthetic acceptance of these issues. So there's greater awareness of the issue, but what am I saying here? There's not a complementarity between an aesthetic sensibility about minority cultures and engagement with social reality. So, to put it all in one phrase, what we need in minority language cultures is a major reality check, and we start dealing with these issues from a societal approach rather than a sectoral approach like at the minute. And I'll leave it like that. It's been a long session, so I thank you for your patience, and I thank you for your questions.
You stressed the responsibility of say, the leaders, the political leaders, or the responsibles for the policies in our countries. Playing devil's advocate now, to which extent, well, they are to blame in the sense that they don't admit reality, that. I fully agree. At least you have to be sincere, and if you cannot do it, just go home. That's fine. However, for instance here, whenever you try to make a step, you have the court on your head. You have the majority language militancy, which is as a state backing it, as judges, so on and so forth. It makes it really almost impossible to advance. So I don't know what's the situation like in Ireland or Scotland, but here that's the case. So what can they do in that case?
It's slightly different in my context, because at a superficial level it tends to be supportive, but it's, as they say in religion, it's a bit like lip service. So you say things, but then in reality the constituency of people who would be negatively disposed wouldn't be as vociferous as in the Spanish state. However, it comes to the same end, that it's the indifference and hostility lead to the same outcome. That we're back to the issue of, does the group in its own context, does it have the thinking, the strategy and the resource to act for itself? You could turn the question around the other way. If the majority speakers were more supportive, you're still left with all the questions. Because you have to answer, well, right, we have more resource, we have better politicians, and we have a less aggressive opposition. We still have to decide what we're going to do. The difficulty with, I think, what some of the language promotion bodies, they say, if you don't deal with our naivety, we'll throw you to the wolves and we'll deal with the hostile people. So it's a very, very difficult choice. And normally, people are wise. They choose the less hostile. But we're left with the question. You can see it when you have a very, very small group. The level of endangerment is massive. Continue with what you're doing and it will not exist in the next generation, basically in the next stage. So therefore, the point is, I think rather than going for starting with the political issue, what you have to start with is the thinking. Is the thinking right? And I think a lot of the difficulties in Ireland and Scotland start with the academic and the discursive class. Those who have framed the thinking. They framed the thinking in a way that is way too limited. It doesn't address those true reality.
Too limited in the sense of not ambitious enough.
Yes,
Just limited to maintaining the minority languages in their present state without thinking of expansion.
Well, maintaining, it's more than that. It's maintaining sectors, maintaining their privilege, maintaining the current focus, because it's one of the slides I left out. It's this issue of, they call it path dependency. You set up a way of doing something, and once it's established, you become less critical of the situation. Minority language speakers do not have that luxury. You either get it right or you disappear. We're investing way too much energy, resource, and strategy in non-optimal approaches. The approach is not working. Why would we stick with an approach that doesn't work? That's the issue. And this is why I refer to the intellectual debate, the way it's framed. That is part of the difficulty. That is preventing us from addressing reality. And again, if you have a sore leg and you go to the doctor and the doctor says, no, I'm not going to do this, not your leg. Because that would be upsetting to the other practitioners in my medical practice. Let's use a metaphor. That's basically the argument we're at.
Well, I absolutely agree with the notion that we have to face reality and on the other hand, that existence of that elite that wants to keep their privileges or their ability to control the way linguistic policy is made. But at the same time, it's in reality too depressing to face it plainly. I mean, it's not like a psychological coping mechanism for something that's so difficult to revert.
It is, yes. It's distressing for minority groups. They see every generation a little weaker than their own generation. So if you feel very strongly about your own collective group, about your own culture, it must be very difficult. But surely the only way to give them hope is to institute a strategy that deals with reality. I see your point. Basically, what some of the dominant class in minority language policy are saying, this is basically all we can get, so we should be happy with it. But if the ultimate trajectory is that of erasure, you have to ask the question, what is the point? Because that becomes another policy instrument of majoritarian culture. If it's majoritarian, we don't need it, basically.
Can you give an example of a minority language policy that has been successful in halting the decline?
There are cultures that have done more in education, but I don't know of, and I've been studying these issues for over 20 years, I don't know of any minority culture that has halted the decline of the native speaking group when it's in this minoritized
The French Canadians are not a minority culture.
no, because they're not, in their own social geography, they're not minoritized.
And French is a very powerful language.
I will think of the success of the Welsh language compared with the other Celtic languages of northwestern Europe.
Yes.
Britain, Ireland, Brittany. The overwhelmingly obvious success story is Welsh.
Yes.
And I wonder how has Welsh been able to manage things so that it's still pretty thriving?
Everything in life is comparative and comparable, I suppose. The Welsh group is much bigger, so it's the Gaelic group of Ireland and Scotland are small-scale, small-sized minority groups. The Welsh, like the Basques, are a medium-sized minority group.
But why hasn't Welsh followed that trend of reduction, of decline over the centuries, which is the case in Ireland and Scotland?
Because there's two main reasons. They didn't have the same 19th century that the Gaelic group had in Ireland and Scotland, very traumatic politically and socially, where they lost the density of population that were Gaelic speakers. By the time the 20th century came along, they were a peripheral speaker group, mostly isolated to rural areas with agriculture-based economy. When the 20th century was becoming industrialized and a diversified economy. But the other point is that if you have large numbers of speakers in high densities in different areas, and it has participants in the culture, which is the Welsh context and the Basque context, well, that creates a leadership, a class structure. You can have a fairly elaborate intellectual life, fairly elaborate discursive debates. As your group declines, it loses its social diversity, therefore it loses its ability to manage the debate. This is why it's ironic that after 100 years of language policy in Ireland, we basically haven't gone through the process of coming up with our own diagnosis of the problem. Even after all the millions we spent on research projects, I'm talking about the dominant policy, not there are fine researchers there. But basically what we've done is we've modified the French-Canadian language policy, which suits millions of speakers for a language that has a few, tens of thousands of speakers. It's a different situation, and the other difficulty we have, this probably answers your question in another way, that, and I think I mentioned this, because it's much easier to help school children who have a curricular interest in Irish as social policy, rather than engaging with communities, these local empowerment initiatives that I think should be engaged with. Politicians love simple answers to difficult questions, and the simple answer to all the minority cultures, and they all do it to an extent, they emphasize the schooling system, and generally the thinking they do about the communal aspect is, as we say in Ireland, they're only making it up as they go along.
Sorry,
They're only making it up as they go along. They're not putting serious thinking into it. It is a sociological challenge, therefore it needs to be dealt with at the level of sociology and political science. And the level of debate in our universities, in those departments, in sociology and politics, when it comes to cultural diversity in Ireland, is basically, and they won't be very happy, and I know this is being recorded, but I'm willing to say it, the level of thinking about these issues is infantile. What? Infantile. It's children can do as good as the child. Because what they've done, see, if you emphasize language promotion, you make it purely a language issue and a cultural issue, but these issues are social and political. We need to shift the balance. It's fine having a school policy, it's fine having a cultural policy, it's fine having aesthetic practitioners, those who take a cultural issue with the issues, or cultural interest in the issues. But we can't, that is not a substitute for good social and political thinking on these issues. And if the Irish state, as I say, we've probably spent billions on this issue since the foundation of the state, the amount of resources, political energy we spent on it, and what do we have to show for it? A vernacular native speaking group that is now less than 20,000 people, and that speaking group, as are those two pieces of research I showed earlier, that research clearly indicates that the existing generation of young speakers are essentially the final social group that will have experienced a native speaking community. The next community will find it under current circumstances. The next generation will find it very difficult to renew itself under current circumstances. Therefore, the only choice for us is to change the circumstances so that they become more beneficial to creating a next generation of speakers. I think it was your point there, we need hope, but hope without reality is useless. What you're doing is you're only fooling yourself. And members of the minority speaking group, they're not stupid. They see exactly what's happening because it's happening in front of them on a day-to-day basis. They see this gap between rhetoric and aspiration and what's happening to them on a day-to-day basis. It's some of what I'm talking about is we're looking for some discursive honesty, analytical honesty, that those in charge of the issues would be honest with the speakers. If you try to fool the speakers, it's no wonder that the policy doesn't work. It's based on a misdiagnosis of a problem that is much more difficult and complex than is assumed by those in charge.
It's strange to me that you use the term neolibertarian. Neoliberal.
Yeah.
Because I think what you are proposing is really very liberal. It's you are talking about on elites, on the government, on the academia, on NGOs who lives from maintaining the problem, and you're proposing that these people can solve the problem, and maybe we have to empower the first language, the minority language users. But I go back to my first question, how we can make these people start to decide, and not only the first the minority language speakers, the second language speakers also. How we can make them understand they have heritage, they have a culture, they have something that is valuable, and they have to spend money, resources, time, everything to keep it.
Yes. Yes, I take your point. It would be great if the leaders of language promotion bodies were less neoliberal and more liberal, as you're saying, but there's another issue that we're missing, that there's not enough democracy. So democracy is a focus on the people, on ordinary experience, on lived reality, and so in order for these leaders of the language sectors to be liberal, in other words, to divest themselves of the neoliberalism at the minute.
I think I'm socialist.
Yeah. What we need at the minute is to open up the debate, engage with different voices, in a more informed debate in our intellectual classes, in our universities, that they also need to face reality. They are way too invested in the current approach, and a current approach that isn't working. So if those in charge could start to admit the non-optimal aspects of reality, well, that would open up the debate. That would make the debate democratic. Before we get anywhere here, we need to introduce democratic values to minority language cultures. Basically, I think, despite all the well-meaning rhetoric of the language rights, and it's based on rights, what we have is a highly controlled and a highly contained. In other words, we're containing an issue rather than trying to open it up. Look at the positives of it, and also look at the drawbacks, the negatives, what is holding us back, what is making the situation worse.
This is very common, I think. This is the question I wanted to ask before, a comment I wanted to make. Recently, there have been some news about a problematic quarter outside of the city here in Valencia, yes. And it's because somebody in the 80s decided to collect different group of families, say 600 families, 1,000 families, yes. Who had social problems, so on. I mean, they put them together, forget them, and now, of course, the thing exploded. It explodes continuously. And I was listening to the radio. There was a report on the place, and the diagnosis was the same as the one we did. Yes. So they put lots of money, but the money is lost. No solutions in the end. And this is the same speech, the same kind. So this is quite extended. The way how you are describing the thing working in linguistics. Yeah. It's quite spread.
A friend of mine, I think you met him as well, Ferran Suay from the National University of Ireland in Galway. He says that it's easy to find easy answers to difficult questions, but the problem with the easy answers is they're always wrong.
Yeah.
So if anybody looking for a quick fix will make the situation more complex, more difficult.
Is there a lot or little distance between vernacular language and the language promoted, I mean the standard language promoted from the body language plan? The cultural plan?
Very, very much so. This is, it's even more complex than that. The difference between learned Irish and native spoken Irish is enormous. But the other issue now, because of incomplete acquisition or non-optimal acquisition, that in some circumstances and in some native speaking communities, the young find it difficult to understand the grandparents and vice versa. That shows the power of the acquisition of the majority language in the social geography of the minority. And again, this issue, if the emphasis on bilingualism in the policy, how can we say that's a success when these communities are becoming less bilingual? So, for example, this is a personal and emotional issue. It must be very, very difficult for certain families where the grandparents will speak the majority language because the level of acquisition of the minority language among the infants and the young is so weak that it's easier for them to communicate the majority language. It's what I'm sorry. What I'm saying there.
You need to turn it on.
It's on. It's on.
Is it?
Okay, the lights are green.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
No.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Excuse me. That's a very good question. The point I'm making there is that if the majority language is the most competent language, even in a minority language situation, of the grandparents and of the infants, and if the grandparents find it difficult to understand the style of the minority language that is spoken by the infants and children, you can see why they would switch over to the majority language, because the majority language then becomes the lingua franca, the language that is understood by everybody. So this is the reason I emphasize this dynamic approach, that unless you can form policy to support the benefits in the different sectors of socialization. For example, if we have very weak first language socialization, the first quadrant, then there's very weak peer group reinforcement. So that's so young people meeting each other in schools or colleges or whatever. If that reinforcement isn't very elaborate, well, then the young people have very little experience of seeing the language used in cultural contexts. Therefore, a weaker exposure to different contexts means a weaker vocabulary, a weaker confidence, a weaker ease, probably less wit in the language because they haven't seen witty exchanges in the minority language. So what we're essentially trying to do with this promotion is we're emphasizing schools, but that's the third phase in what you need to do to acquire a minority language. We think we can compensate for social and societal processes by schooling. And if the Irish experience of minority language planning and policy has showed anything, you cannot compensate for social or societal weakness by schools alone. So you get competent speakers of minority languages after they've gone through primary and secondary phases of socialization in that language. You cannot compensate through institutions alone.
Surely it's very serious for the welfare of the language if children are learning in the first quadrant a certain version of the language from their parents and grandparents, and then when you come to the third quadrant, school is teaching them another version of the language. that's suicidal.
It's very,
I mean,
it's,
I think
it's,
that happens.
yes, yes.
I mean, I'm not think about it. I think that happens here in Valencia, and I didn't know it happened in the island.
It can. It's not as prevalent in areas where you have the higher densities of native speakers. But for example,
But isn't Irish taught in school standard throughout all Ireland?
but in the native speaking areas, the teachers could be speakers of the native dialect. So they don't. Some of the written curricula could be in the standard, but if the teachers speak to them in the local dialect, well, therefore, in that circumstance, they're getting reinforcement of the spoken dialect in the schooling system. But for example, your point is true. In the weaker areas of the Gaeltacht that have gone through the language shift, they don't necessarily have teachers who speak that dialect in the schools, so therefore they would be teaching a standardized spoken version and written version, but the density is lost in those areas anyhow, so basically it's another issue then. It's an issue of having any language in certain areas, either standard or dialect.
But that version of Irish which is being taught everywhere, is it the vernacular language anywhere, or is it a kind of educated version of a language that is like High German?
There is a written standard which is used in the curriculum, but the written standard is for texts, it's not for speaking. So the native speakers don't actually speak it. The learners, the second language learners, can have a version of it, all right, to a certain level of acquisition. But it's, again, what was the point we're making, where 40% of the population are claiming they can speak Irish. But that's from people who can say hello in Irish to those who are our tangential group, who've learned it to a very fluent level that they can participate in a social group, a social teenage peer group, for instance. So the difference in that, it's like it's a massive S-curve, basically, of different competences. But I was mostly, in what I was referring to in Ireland, I'm mostly talking about the Gaeltacht or the native speaking areas, many of whom have undergone language shift already.
I have, since some months ago, I have a wild idea, some saying this organization called Hablamos Español, Let's Talk Spanish, who advocate for bilingual education. Well, they say bilingual, this is the first step to a monolingual Spanish education, but they have communication power, so they can use communicate their message. I think we have to debate with them.
Yes.
You would have to. Well, that's my question. What do you think? It is good to debate with them, so publicly everybody can know about what we think, what they think.
Yes. You're right. We need more debate if we're going to increase the emphasis on democratic values. More opinion has to be brought to bear on the debate. Those emphasising the bilingual aspirations are fine, but you look at the minority native-speaking groups, and they're bilingual already, simply because of the social power of the majority. So when I hear the policy officials talking about bilingualism, I always say that would be a very good idea. It's the issue for bilinguals that is primarily for monolingual, and the monolingual group comes from the majority culture. So what we don't talk about, this is the reality check thing we were talking about earlier, where we have the bilingual speakers and the social trajectory among the minority bilingual speakers is that they're becoming less bilingual. In other words, they're becoming more monolingual. Surely that's the primary issue before we start talking about the aspiration to make majority speakers bilingual. In other words,
there's no point in trying to promote the diversity of the majority speakers before we start talking realistically about protecting the existing amount of bilingual minority speakers that we have, where the overall reality is that in most of these very small minority groups in Western Europe and in other parts of the globe are probably not going to survive 1 or 2 more generations, given the level of thinking, resource and strategy that we're putting into it at the minute. Basically, the thinking and resource is too weak for the problem that's at hand. The problem is much more difficult than we're willing to admit publicly, or that the public bodies are willing to resource it. So it's, what I'm calling for is a type of a democratic sea change where we open up these language bodies to face reality. That's the starting point. The level of denialism, even in some large minority groups, is one of the components of the destruction of these groups. More so, I think it was your question there, more so than the hostility of the majority group. These minorities have been living with hostility for hundreds of years before there was any promotional support for these groups. Now we have promotional support, and these people in charge of these groups, they become part of the majority apparatus that is allowing the erasure or the disappearance of these groups. That is the main issue, not the hostility of the majority speakers. In other words, we've set up resource, we set up dedicated bodies, and those bodies start becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And your question is so good. There is no starting point unless we have a democratic culture around these issues. And what we have is we have majoritarian democratic culture. We don't have minoritarian democratic, or minoritarian is that. We don't have minority democratic culture that is sufficient to the task we are trying to deal with.
Com prou li diria que jo la primera vegada que el vaig sentir parlar d'això també tenia la idea que parlava d'una realitat molt distant de la nostra, però conforme he anat parlant i jo mirava les vostres cares he vist que tots reconeixíem que d'això que ell està parlant nosaltres també tenim un vestit d'això.
I important recordar que tots els pobles dels que ha parlat han perdut una guerra, o dues. Això també és important.
Per tant, em sembla que sí que ha sigut significatiu per a tots i moltes gràcies per haver vingut i fins a la pròxima. Thank you very much.